Hey folks, yeah, thank you very much. Thanks, Jenna. And it's great to be here and see some familiar faces, and I think a few new people as well. So just to kind of get us started, what I want to say is I'm expecting a mix of people that are watching this, some who have been kind of in the demos and meetings of Cypress Accessibility as your company was evaluating it and acquiring it, but also a couple of folks who are maybe newer to the system itself or newer to Cypress. And so I'm going to do a few different things. The first thing I'd like to do is a refresher of just how the system works to make sure we're all on the same page. And then after that, I'd like to look at some of the more advanced topics around configuration and using the results API, show you some of the things that have shipped over the last year that change things about how the interface works or how to share issues. And also then some of the higher level just concepts of merging something like the results from Cypress Accessibility with your overall automation process. So we'll get stuck right into this, and I'll kind of bounce back and forth between the slides and the browser to look at some examples as well. We'll look at a tiny bit of code and running some stuff locally. So just an informal tour of a couple of topics and trying to make sure we're all up to date, and we can surface any questions that you might have about this as well. So first of all, this is what the reports look like. I'm assuming if you're here, you've at least been inside Cypress Accessibility. We don't need to set that much context, but it is worth reminding us how the system works. So if you're recording to Cypress Cloud, you're not doing anything additional in your tests. There's two parts to the process. One is capturing and the results themselves and testing them server-side in the cloud. That happens just by recording with test replay enabled. So nothing extra for you to do there. And then Cypress takes this other step of organizing and consolidating all of these reports that are generated based on your test replay data that sees all the variations of your application as your tests move through it. And so this is how it comes to the default list of pages and views in your report and where all the rules come from as well, where you click a rule and you see any violation of that rule from anywhere in the application. When we think about topics later in this presentation, like how we're doing configuration, ignoring elements or ignoring certain pages is all about filtering down what happens in step 2 so that it focuses in on the stuff you really care about out of all of the URLs you might visit and things like that. And just a reminder, these are the goals of what we want you to be able to do with the product. So first of all, understanding the accessibility status of a project at a glance. You can always look at the newest run. Nothing's out of date. Nothing's getting put into spreadsheets and Word documents that you have to pass around to capture accessibility issues. And then 2 weeks later, when that work is getting discussed, it's already 2 weeks of code changes behind. So wanting to keep this really fresh, help you communicate about the issues as well. If you're not doing this already, you should be able to be comfortable sharing reports from Cypress Accessibility outside of the QA team or the engineering team if there's feedback needed from product or design, where you just show leadership examples of what's happening because they're so visual and they include all the information about exactly what happened in the application as it looked during the test. The hope is that this cross-team communication can work really well, and I know some of you are doing that already. And then finally, there's this debugging workflow, which depending on your organization, if you're a QA person who does not come in there and adjust the code and do front-end type work, then you may not be using this much of the aspect of the cloud, but it's worth knowing about it so you can surface it to the dev team that you might be handing issues over to if they're less experienced with the cloud and Cypress Accessibility. Again, mostly for the new people, here are just some example of what you might do using the reports in Cypress Cloud. So you can kind of slice and dice through all the pages and components if you have component tests that were captured in the report. And all you have to do to get these in there is write tests that visit these pages and perform actions. So this will be a way to see of all of the places in my app, which one has the most failed rules. That's something that you can check out here. We also see some severity indications. There's a few other details like how many elements are failing or how many elements have incomplete checks that we'll get into more information about later. Next thing we can do is look at what are your most critical rules, or what are your most commonly failing rules. So combining some filters here and some sorting, we can see in this example project that we're going to look at, the rule that has the most elements failing is form elements must have labels within the critical severity level. I use this example a lot because it's very visual and easy to kind of bring across on a call like this. This is what happens in the application when you see buttons must have discernible text. You can go through and like debug from here if you want to, but also this new functionality that shipped just a few weeks ago allows you to share. So if you didn't see it yet, it's this new actions list, which currently just has one thing in it to share the issue. In the future, we will be looking at adding configuration type actions as well. So this is a starting point for that. But for now, if you hit that share button, you get a list of attributes related to that particular issue, including the link to how to fix it that's based on DQ University's reporting about each individual rule. Also the link to this exact element with this exact snapshot open in Cypress Cloud. And you can put that into a Jira issue or something like that. If you copy the markdown, you'll get a nice format for like a Jira style bug report. And if you just copy the plain text, that might be fine for sending it in Slack or something like that. But the idea here is that we give you enough information to communicate this issue with all of the details that you would want without trying to throw the kitchen sink at it and include everything. I've already had 1 or 2 requests for additional details in here, like the WCAG success criteria and things like that. So we will be extending this to include more details. And as you use this, think about what other information you might be copying out of the UI into a bug report. That's exactly the stuff we want to capture and turn into one click. And then in the new year as well, we'll be looking at Jira as another option at the top here. And further on from that, things like a PDF or other types of sharing related to issues, either at the element level or at a higher level than that. So since you're already here and using the product, it's also useful to get the juices flowing and ask, where do you see yourself using this type of sharing functionality? What types of formats would you need to communicate something outside of Cloud that we can pull for you from the details available here? To get into the just high level of how accessibility works in Cypress, this is the button issue that we're familiar with. It has no label text. So here we have an accessibility tree node in the browser for the button that has no name, and that has an effect on downstream technology like screen readers or using voice control to say something to interact with the button. The premise of Cypress Accessibility using Axe Core as the underlying tool is that we can detect issues like this that are kind of structure-based in the DOM and have significance for disabled users. This is the type of solution that we do for that. We can add an ARIA label that has no visual impact, but it adds the context needed for somebody to understand this in audio format and be able to take the same action and know the effect of the button, because it produces the accessibility tree that makes sense. So for the entire workflow here, there is a really helpful shortcut in the UI that I kind of wanted to call out here. And I'm going to switch over to browser to just show this. For some of you, this will be, one more time. Here, when we look at the behavior, let's come over to a tab that has this. So we see the button is highlighted here, and we have this buttons must have discernible text rule. Your brand new people to accessibility who might join your team can use the Learn More button to get into all the information about this rule. But your developer or yourself who's going to come in and explore this can do that through the browser as well. Going to open up the DevTools here and use the Print to Console shortcut. This is useful because it always gets you the exact right element. You can right-click and you can do normal DOM stuff in here because it's not a screenshot, it really is the DOM. But when you right-click and try to find this element, there's a couple things that can trip you up because of layers in the DOM and things like that. So here you'll always get the exact right one. We can always take it to the element panel and get into the accessibility tree, which is like the last option in this menu if you're not familiar with getting here in DevTools. So you've got styles and you've got the computed styles and layout properties and stuff, and then accessibility is in there built into Chrome under here. We can see there is that empty node name, so there's no available information in the API that a screen reader would use. And just really quick, I'm going to add the ARIA label attribute that we saw there. And we're just going to put in some text. It says, hi, folks. We see it in the accessibility tree. We see it here. So the whole idea of being able to do this in the cloud is that I cannot have this running locally if I don't need to. And I can fool around with the CSS and the front end and determine what's happening in the browser, hopefully without having to run it locally. And if I have multiple pull requests open or multiple projects, this can be a lot faster and less disruptive. I'll show you one other example of how you would use this or benefit from doing this type of debugging in the browser. And that's if I take away the ARIA label again. And if someone just said, oh yeah, the code change is we're going to go over to our editor. This is missing a label. I'm just going to put it into the button. So when I edit this as HTML, we can come through and we can say, maybe I should put the hi folks text in here. And this is where having the snapshot shows up really well because it live updates in the browser just because it's normal browser behavior to do that. And we can see that that solution, which is number 1 here, that had a visual side effect that we would not want. So this combination of having the DOM, having it in the browser, not having to do that locally can really give you an accelerated debugging process for a lot of simple issues like this, and even for more complicated labels labeled by multiple things or form fields that are, have more complicated DOM going on. So the other thing that I've been looking at with customers and thinking about that has evolved over the years. So for those of you who joined us like earlier in the process, December, January, February, we hadn't really seen a lot of patterns developing at that stage because it was still early days for the product. But now one of the most important things I've seen is like, how can we contain the number of rules that have any failures at all? Getting from 1 to 0 on a rule kind of puts it in this class of fully passing green rules that your organization has no failures of. And it's much easier to protect those things that are already green than it is to kind of make a case for fixing a rule that already has 2,000 violations and now you've got 2004. It's much harder to justify doing that work in a pull request to say, well, I'm not going to like add this little pile onto the massive pile. But if you have something that's green and your pull request is making it red, that is much clearer of a line that it's definitely the responsibility of that particular piece of code that's changing, or that PR that might have merged in between your nightly runs or anything like that. So for finding low-hanging fruit, using the UI to sort and filter to say, okay, we can see which rules are almost passing, especially within a category like critical or serious that you're already maybe focused on. Doing mini projects to clean those up will give you just like gradually smaller and smaller surface area of rules that have any problems at all. And I think this is really effective at making the product have as much signal as possible. And the other aspect of this then that we'll talk about is maybe there's rules that you don't need to respond to just yet. You can configure those away, or you can configure pages out of your system that you're not going to address, so that when you do look at these reports, you're seeing things that are meaningful to you and you don't have to do any mental math of, oh, that's a known issue that we're not going to fix because it's in a third-party page or something like that. So as much as possible, everything in this report should be like meaningful and useful and related to things that you would want to get green. So to that end, there's some configuration that is in your hands now that might not have been there at the beginning of the year. And this lets you do a few things around the URLs that are happening. You can definitely include URLs or not, just by like completely say, okay, this type of URL or this pattern of URL shouldn't be in the report. That's one thing. The other is you can combine your different pages under a single view if they have like the same underlying template or something, to where you don't need to see 400 different product pages. You need to see example.com/product/star, and that will be the single view that you can go to look for all of the accessibility issues that are in that part of your website. So to look at the Cypress real world app example, This happens here in the transaction page automatically. If we see something that looks like a UUID, the URL behavior is going to be just automatic to work this way. But if your IDs in the URL are a little bit, creative or mixed patterns, so it's not obvious that that's an ID, that's where the problem comes in. And that's what configuration is designed to solve. You can just make up your own rules to merge these pages the way you need to. Down at the bottom of this screen, you can see the actual URL that the snapshot came from. I guess I'll hide this here. Yeah. The actual URL the snapshot came from is here. So this has that ID that was at the end. And if we came through and looked for like a different snapshot or something like that, cycle through, we can see different URLs potentially for different transactions. And that's what's going on with kind of URL grouping config. All this information is here in the new documentation. So another part of this call is to surface that we've done a good bit of work on the docs. We have some more coming, some more kind of high-level guide content coming, but the actual just like details of how is everything working, how are we using all of the words you see in the UI, how is the score calculated, that's all now in the public docs and has been since the time of GA. So there's stuff to look at in here, and this is where something like the views config and those patterns can be found. Here's where that's all documented. The other thing I'll mention in here is ignoring elements. I think that we'll move on straight to that and talk about the behavior that goes with that. This is different than how ignoring works in most implementations of Axe Core and most accessibility systems. For pages and for kind of rule level config that we could do for you, when those things are ignored, they're just like outside of the spotlight of the report. But for what pages and things are included in the report, if you ignore specific elements, we always keep that data. So we'll still run Axe Core and gather the result for an element that you've ignored, but we will move it into this category that you can see down here where you have to filter to turn this back on to see it. And the purpose here is that these things are in the designated area that you wanted to test for accessibility. They're still affecting your users in those pages and components. And so even though we take them out of the score, they're not going to show up as inconclusive or as failing elements. They still have availability there because they're still a part of what affects your users. In practice, that means if you have like a third-party chat widget or a date picker or something that's broken, you can stop that affecting your score and producing noise for you developers who don't own that, but you'll still see the issues there, and you can go and report those as issues to those third parties or whatever you need to do about them. Because again, the workflow that your users go through might have to go through those third-party components. So it's still risk area for you. It's still accessibility barriers for you. However, this lets you be really aggressive about what you need your team to respond to at any given time. You can ignore your entire header from one project because it's tested in another project as well, or do anything you need to so that the elements that do show up in your report are like calibrated to be meaningful to the consumers of that particular project. The other use case for config and for ignoring elements is to address false positives where you see something and you think this is not an accessibility issue. This is a false positive that may come from Axe Core, or it may come from like Cypress testing accessibility on a partially loaded page or something like that. These aren't normal in the system in most projects. We've spent a lot of time, trying to identify and isolate causes that could potentially lead to false positives. So at this point, they're rare, and anytime you see something that you find suspicious, please hit the submit feedback button. I get a few of these like over the year, not very many, and so the more that you do see something, let us know, and we can address that at the level of the system. But also a lot of the time, I will see a kind of debatable false positive discussion around when data is coming into the app, but it's still in a real user-facing state, or there's a loading spinner on the screen or something like that, especially a loading spinner in buttons and things. As long as the page is fully loaded, I would consider that those things should be accessible and the accessibility scan is valid when there is a data pending state, because that state needs to communicate itself to people who have a disability and use a screen reader. And also these are the states that you can get up you can end up stuck in unintentionally. So as you're waiting for this API call, let's say you're on a train and you go through a tunnel and you don't get the signal to get the data back, that user is going to have to, like, for any reason, lose connectivity. That user is going to have to understand what is the content on the page and how do they get themselves back to something else, or just what's going on. So loading states and data pending states, I would always argue, include those in your accessibility report and fix issues when they appear there. But also, they may not be your priority, in which case you have config to do things like detect the HTML contains a spinner in a certain area, so temporarily ignore that area. And if you're looking at those types of config and you need any assistance to do that as well with CSS selectors and stuff, you can also use this submit feedback button to get some help on that from us. As I mentioned, ignoring views and then Axe core rules that we would configure with you, these are turned off at the processing level. So if you ignore a certain URL, we won't process anything for accessibility scans for that URL. This is like, okay, you want to ignore like the Microsoft login flow or something like that. What I've seen in practice, what we're about to talk about next as well, is most people leave everything turned on for the actual reports themselves in the cloud. So when we look at something like the Cypress Real World app having this report with everything in here, I'm going to turn on the passing and everything as well. Everything is here and available to look at that anybody at the org might be interested in. So this is in this configuration, it's not necessary that the developer comes in every single run and looks at every rule or anything like that. The reason that people do this is because they can configure the API side of things to implement a policy of what rules are going to be failures and require attention. And this is a more flexible way to do that and integrate with a lot of other kind of business priorities. So we're going to take a couple of steps to look at how that works and how you might approach doing that for one of your own projects. And then hopefully it'll all kind of come together as to why it's usually fine to leave everything on that you might want to see in the cloud. What I've done on this list of things here is just simplified it to only the critical issues that are in the real world demo app that we have. And I see kind of three categories here. The first is your backlog of critical issues that would need to be corrected to get them passing. So there's a bunch of things in here, and there's a bunch of other issues that are just either passing or have no failures, but only manual review. And if you haven't got to a state that you can adopt the entire rule set and enforce every pull request or every nightly kind of monitoring build must pass the pull request, must pass every Axe core rule, then this is where you can come in and say, actually, there is an implied standard because a bunch of stuff is already passing or is rules that don't apply to us right now. So that's the thing that I want to have a backstop on. And then this other area in red at the top is where we have work to do. And the question is, how do we burn down that list over time to get everything to be green and get 100% to be really meaningful? You have two options there. You can configure some rules to be off for a while, and we definitely have at least one customer that is down to just one or two rules as a starting point, and we're going to work with them to expand that surface area. And you can also choose the ones that are the low-hanging fruit we talked about earlier, where when there's a low number of failures, you could probably squeeze that into a sprint. You could probably make some progress on those types of issues without it becoming a whole project that requires buy-in and multiple parties and overhead that makes accessibility work difficult to do. And then once those are clean, you can work on reducing the numbers above as well, but in a sort of burning down technical debt kind of way, if you can't get the full space to just work on remediation as a project. So here's how the results API can help with that. And this is kind of a context switch here too, so I'll just step back for a second to look at the docs and explain. And if you haven't seen this yet, this came out around the middle of the year, and this gives you an extra step in your CI process where you can look for accessibility results from the run that you just recorded. So in addition to everything appearing in the cloud, this is where you would come in and pull the data to fail a step in CI or do something else. So it's documented here in our docs now. There's a helper package that can identify the run based on the environment variables you have. So usually it's pretty simple to implement this. And this is something that has been used in various ways that we'll talk about in a second. But the actual steps of like writing the code here, you can copy and paste what we already have as the example code. I've simplified it here just a little bit to say, first you would write the code to import this helper function and define those existing failed rules as your rules that are allowed to keep failing for the short term. And then you call this function after Cypress is completed. So your Cypress run is green, everything is passing, and you see all of the accessibility processing complete. This will automatically poll for that to finish, and usually it's just a couple of minutes after the overall run completes. Then you can compare what violations were detected with the existing violations that you know are there, and you can yell at people if they've introduced a failure from a rule that was fully passing before. You can do a bunch of other things like with this data once you have it, but the key is really the helper function you can call that yields you the results, and that's the underlying thing that lets you do a bunch of things downstream. In this case, using a GitHub Actions example, this is a separate step that comes in after component testing and end-to-end testing might have been combined into one run in the cloud. So they've provided component and end-to-end information for accessibility to be checked. You can see a visual regression step was here with Percy as well. There were some other types of testing that happened. But the one thing that failed was this verify accessibility results step. So this is how you can implement that standard and get developers to have their attention called to Cypress Cloud when they have done something specific, as opposed to just always having to go in and look at the actual results. In this case, here's a passing version of this check. It is added as a GitHub status check in this particular project that's looking to that CI step. Because you get this information in your CI process and you're in JavaScript land or something like that when you do these reports, you can do anything that needs to happen after this. So people have described capturing the data for their other accessibility dashboard that also includes a mobile test or something like that. You can use any other webhooks or APIs to trigger a Slack message in specific situations. And to that end, we've had a couple of requests for adding the accessibility score and the view names and the related issues in all of the views to the API. So we expect to do that soon, and that would let you do more downstream decision-making about the nature of the results. The first use case for that is sending messages to specific teams who own particular areas of the application if there's accessibility issues on URLs that those teams own. So that's something that we can support through the API itself by adding some details there. But as you use it and as you come up with use cases for various data points, it's really valuable to share those with us because I don't want the API to become bloated with kind of speculation about what people will do. I would much rather drive it with actual use cases. There's another thing I wanted to highlight here as well, which is how we get local feedback. This is something I've discussed on calls with several of you. It often comes up in the early demos, but I'm also not sure people carry this forward into their normal development practice. The first thing to know is you can record to the cloud from your local machine with no in-between steps at all. It's just an extra flag and a variable to tell Cypress when you run it locally to record this to a particular cloud project. This can let you get feedback from Cypress Accessibility in the cloud without pushing code and letting your entire build process run and your full Cypress suite happen and then see the results. You can do it for just one spec. So I thought I'd show that here and just give an example of how that works. So I've got some code up here. This is just the auth spec from the Cypress real world app. And I've got a command at the bottom just to run this with the record flag. I've set the Cypress record key as an environment variable. That's one thing you also need here. But then I'm passing in -- spec and the particular spec that I want to run. So when I hit enter here, this is going to do a local run of Cypress Cloud. This app is running locally as well, so the spec should do its normal behavior. It's estimating 30 seconds for this particular spec to run because that's what it normally takes. And if I look at this real-world app project in the cloud, this has actually got a spinner already up here, so there's something happening there. And let's just refresh, not wait for it to poll. So this run is being recorded to the cloud. It's already done and accessibility is processing. So as soon as this spec completes, we're going to have results here from the local version of the code. So when we get access to this, we'll just see whatever content is in there for that particular spec. So compared to the bigger run we looked at earlier, this only has one spec, it has ACE test results. You'll have a different score and everything because you're only seeing snapshots that were processed based on what that one spec actually did. So if we came in and click through here, we can see here's all of the failures from there. There was actually 58 individual snapshots that existed in that run and received an axe core check, and then all those results were merged. So this is still much faster than trying to check all 58 states that were reached during that test, like manually with a DevTools extension or something like that. That process can apply even if you have 100 or 200 or whatever number of different snapshots covered by the set of tests you choose to run. And of course, we didn't have to wait for a build or anything like that. Next thing to talk about, and we start to kind of bounce around topics a little more now that are just the things I thought would be interesting, which is when you see an accessibility issue reported by Xcore or Cypress or any other tool, treating that as a sign to look in more detail at the accessibility of the related area. I know there's a good bit of text on here, and we'll be able to share these slides as well with participants. But the idea here is anywhere you see like a missing button or nested interactive fields or something like that, those are signals that the accessibility of that area might not have been considered in a lot of detail when it was being built. So in order to optimize your manual testing time and be able to choose like what to do with the screen reader, look at areas that had failures related to automation a lot more closely, because those are areas where there's more risk, I would think, of things that you might detect manually. And so you can do that kind of in manual testing mode, but then you can also write regression tests that represent that. So a good example is a form field. I think if we look back at our report here, there's a sign-in page, and it's got these two forms, these two form fields with labels. And if we accidentally programmatically reversed these or something, you wouldn't know that till you got a screen reader in there and found it. But then you can write a normal Cypress assertion. So you can actually really boost the overall coverage from your automation pipeline by having Cypress assertions around behavior that is relevant to accessibility that you determine by inspecting more closely. So if we're just fixing the button label and not looking at the surrounding context, we're kind of missing the broader thing that the automation can tell us about what we could fix there and how we should test it. Next example I have is how we can do production monitoring. And this has come up a few times where people have sites that have a lot of content. So you might have a CMS where people are editing things on the fly in production, and it's not really code changes introducing accessibility problems. It's Mark getting creative with design, and I'm putting like a form inside of a table, like inside of an accordion, inside of a heading or something like that. Just because that produces visually interesting things or the appropriate effect that I want to have. But I'm a content editor. I'm not experienced with accessibility, so I would have no idea that I'm introducing problems. A really simple way to get a lot of coverage on content-heavy sites or things that are really sensitive to content author behavior, not code changes, is to use the sitemap or some other array of URLs. And I'm showing the code here for using the sitemap. And the key thing is we use sci.request to go and get it. Yeah, we'll look at the example actually. So here we use sci.request to go and get the Ally project website as an example. And then I'm just pulling the body of that XML for the sitemap out of it. And we're using DOM parser to turn this into something that is more like, a standard DOM that we can do query selector all on to find the LOC elements. I am not familiar with the most efficient way to do all of this. I Googled it this morning, and this was a test that I was able to create as an example. But it looks about similar to the ones that customers have shown us that they've done as well. And the thing is, we get a list of URLs. I'm shortening it here to just not bombard this website that I have nothing to do with traffic. But we can go through, iterate over them with this like Cypress each helper, and then visit it, go down to the bottom, and we'll be able to generate a report there. So I have this one teed up as well. We're going to just run that one accessibility report, that one particular example of spec, and run that locally. And this is something that you would do with like a cron job or on a scheduled job in your CI process that would give you access to the accessibility results for that. So I'm going to bring this up here. Yeah, it's processing already, and we'll see the effect of this. In fact, I have one I made earlier. We'll just jump right to that. So this is an example of what happens when everything is passing. We've turned the filters on, so we see these 100% pages. This is an accessibility-focused website, the Ally project. It's got lots of information about building things in an accessible way. And so we can see, how does Cypress look when everything is passing? We explained that there's no violations there. We captured these snapshots. And they all came just from the test behavior, if we come through here, of iterating through the sitemap pages and doing a visit and a scroll to the bottom for each one. So as we look back through there, there's just 2 URLs, but it could be the full 30 or 40, it doesn't matter. I chose a site that would have no issues, but if we wanted to monitor that on a daily basis, if we were the owners of this project, we could just do that with this particular way of using Cypress Accessibility. Next thing I want to talk about is branch review and run comparison. Some of you have seen early designs from this, and we've been doing a little bit of testing in production ourselves lately. So what you're seeing here is the latest design iteration that's come from that sort of testing. This is a way to compare what happened in one run with another. So if you're making a pull request, that's one example of how to use this. The developer can come in and say, on this PR, before I merge it, what examples of accessibility issues are changing in the code that we're about to merge. So here we can see 3 sections. The first one is new failed rules. This is like what we showed in the results API, where we say, hey, this used to be 0 and now it's got failures. That is the biggest signal that you have introduced an issue at the code level, or that you've discovered an issue in between nightly builds or something like that. So this is the signal that something that used to be passing is now failing. The second section is resolved rules. These are the wins, where it used to be some number and it went to 0. That's also really useful as you're trying to fix something, or maybe you change out a part of your component system and you just want to see the effects of that. This is confirmation that these 2 runs have this rule fixed or something. And then down at the bottom is the gray area, where you have rules that have some changes that still, like in this case, 2.5K element selectors for buttons. Is that increase of 2 really significant and important? It's not necessarily clear. But here you can also see where you can get more information. As you expand any of these, you'll see the different views and pages that have increases or decreases in elements that are failing those rules. We'll share these resources. Some of them are also in the interface in here, where you can see those links as well. And there's a couple of blog posts that I've written, and we're going to continue to put out more kind of accessibility posts, one more later this month, and then a couple in the new year. And just trying to share this kind of information, more kind of practical use cases and things like that, as much as we can in different formats, so it's reaching the right people and you're able to meet your accessibility goals and get the most out of this product.